To me, just very simply, if you are a female, get a female specific shoe.
Amanda, welcome to the Strong Female Athlete podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, really excited to have you here. And guys, for those of you listening, Amanda is a certified athletic trainer. And today we are going to talk about footwear. And on this podcast, we're always talking about controllable things in female athlete performance, like strength training, nutrition, managing load, recovering. But I think footwear is such an important piece to this discussion because it is controllable. And there seems to be more coming out in this space. I know when you and I grew up, there wasn't much available for female footwear, which was really concerning. So, yeah, just really happy to have you on and just dive in on just female specific footwear and cleats. So, maybe we can just start with that. Do female athletes need to have a different cleat as opposed to male athletes?
The simple answer I would say is yes, we do need a different cleat. There is pretty good anatomical and biomechanical evidence that supports that, we should have a female specific design. Now, as far as, what the implications are of that design, like is it really affecting injury rates or performance? That needs to continue to be researched, developed, invested in further. But I think there's a really strong foundational argument for a female specific design. What's interesting is that when you look at the history of cleats, they have traditionally been designed based off of the male Caucasian foot. So right off the bat, that's, negating those gender differences and even ethnical differences that we know exist in foot morphology. Furthermore, within the shoe wear industry, there's always kind of been that mantra of pink it and shrink it, right? So you take that male product, just make it smaller in size, turn it pink and say, okay, yeah, it's a woman's shoe. But really, at the end of the day, that's all just a marketing ploy and not actually getting into the design and addressing some of these anatomical or biomechanical differences. In fact, you mentioned what we've had access to growing up. It actually wasn't until 1995 when Adidas or Nike even marketed their first women's cleat. So pre 1995, it was only a men's cleat or a kid's cleat that women were probably having to choose to figure out and make it work. So, why is this important? I think foot shape is the first place worth starting. So, females, we have a wider forefoot, a narrower heel, shorter arches, and shorter metatarsals compared to males. So, all of that is going to affect the pressure distribution while we're doing activity. An overly simplified way to visualize this is that a male foot is shaped like a rectangle and a female's foot is shaped like a triangle. So if you can just go back to, the putting blocks into shapes game of when we were toddlers, right? If it doesn't fit right, so there's already a little bit of a mismatch there. Then when we dive a little bit deeper into the biomechanics, while wearing cleats specifically, because there's definitely some differences that we see in a cleat versus a running shoe. So what we do know is that during an unanticipated cutting task, females stay on the lateral side of their foot a little bit more. Furthermore, we can also talk about that, how females have greater tendon compliance, which that just means that our tendons are at the microstructure level weaker. They don't dissipate energy as efficiently. And so that can increase strain on the tissues. And then finally, what we do see is that during running and cutting tasks, females also have greater rear foot eversion. So that's the back of the heel kind of moving side to side more so than men do. So when you kind of add this all up, what that means is that, especially when we're talking about agility or change of direction sports like soccer, that you are going to have higher rotational torque forces and tissue strain while trying to stabilize during those movements, which makes you more susceptible for injuries. And so, of course, ACL injuries, that's the biggest one that we're always talking about, with that very well-known, higher rate of incidence amongst our females. And so I would argue that this could be a big factor in that because, we've really focused, of course, on, hip strength and, jump training. And there's lots of things that we can do to help address that ACL injury risk. But I feel like maybe not enough attention has been brought to feet and kind of working from the bottom up now. And so I think this is definitely something that would be interesting to investigate further and see what we can get with that. The other kind of component that you need to understand about cleats is how stiff they are. So obviously it's a pretty rigid plate. It's got those cleats on there, like especially when you're comparing it to a running shoe. And so this stiffer cleat is important for helping with propulsion and thereby improving your running performance, so it shifts that force of application anteriorly. So you really get an easier push off moment. That's why you see like in running shoes and marathon runners, right? That big old springy shoe, like you want that for when you're doing that straight line running. But when you look at agility-based sports, there eventually comes a cutoff to where that stiffness, as much as it's maybe giving you that straight line improvement, it starts to actually decrease your cutting performance because of that alteration, that reduced joint motion. There's an interesting study on females doing some jump landings, and what they found is that when a stiffer cleat, females perceive to be less stable, and therefore when they're landing, they're not going through as much joint motion, having that stiffer landing, which, as we know, then also increases strain on tendons and ligaments. So I think all of that combined, there's like a lot of little small details that prove like, okay, clearly whatever cleat product we have now is not addressing any of these female specific challenges.
Wow, that's so interesting. I haven't heard much on the stiffness side of things. And I think that's kind of the next frontier of all of this, just being able to have a healthy medium of stiffness for that sprinting and then the change of direction. Now, as far as just footwear that's on the market now, so there's Ida Sports who's starting to offer female specific cleats. And then I don't know if you saw, but Adidas came out with their version, which we all saw it coming, right? Like it was only a matter of time. So have you looked into both of these? Do they kind of cover all these aspects? Is there one you like over the other? It's okay to give your opinion.
Yeah, no, for sure. I'm glad you brought them up because I definitely wanted to, bring some brand highlights. So first I want to give a shout out to Ida Sports because they were the first to do this. So they actually are a startup company and they began back in 2019. So they were the first and only, people to have a properly female specific design cleat. And, even now they still are the only company that's all that they are focused on. That's all they do is cleats. And they also offer turf shoes. So then Adidas, yeah, of course. So, that was like 2 weeks ago that they made this announcement. And so it's always kind of comical to me is that, for as big of a brand as they are, I'm like, you're telling me it took you until 2025 for you to finally have a female designed cleat. I think it just goes to show this wider issue of how we're trying to get better investment in women's sports. But for sure, it's great that we finally are having these products. Some other ones that exist. So Nike does have a female specific design brand that they came out with in 2023 because the women's Euros kind of really brought about some fresh releases. But the asterisk there is that there also is a male version of that. So like when you go onto Nike's website, you have to be really mindful that you are getting the women's Phantom Luna, not just the general Phantom Luna. And Puma also is in that same kind of realm. So that same year in 2023, they released a women's fit for a few of their styles. So the Puma Future, Ultras, and Kings all have it, but same deal. There's the male version or there's the female version. So you would have to be very mindful that you pick the Puma Future women's fit, not just the Puma Future, because then you're just going to have the male designed one. But so I guess to dive into like, okay, so what is a female specific design cleat? How are they actually different than a male designed? So the primary thing that they all have is increased medial arch support. a wider toe box, and a narrower heel cup, right? So those kind of three shape differences are going to account for that triangle shaped foot that I had mentioned earlier versus that rectangle. And then another big component to these cleats is the stud type and the placement of the studs. So they are round or semi-conical studs instead of those long, thin, elliptical bladed studs. And they're also less studs are placed on the lateral aspect of the foot, because when we're looking at the theory behind that is to improve that rotational traction and pressure distribution. Because what we know is that with those bladed, as I mentioned, right, we're on the lateral side of our foot more, which increases those forces. So the last thing we want is a cleat that's going to get us that much further stuck in that lateral position. Because then when we go to change direction, we have that high rotational force, and then ergo that increased susceptibility for an ACL tear. So that's probably, those are like the simplest design differences. And it's interesting when you look, so Ida Sports and the Adidas Spark Fusion F50 is the name of the new one that they just released. So those are, so they're very, open and transparent about showing those design differences. Once again, on the Nike and Puma side, it's so kind of hidden and lost in the sauce because they are not really like making a big deal about it. Of course, I think that's going to change because of Adidas's release, because just natural competition, and with all the players that they have access to. But to me, what's most important, so that's 4 different brands, and they all have different levels of options, right? As far as the range of affordability, they've got like their basic models to their like elite professional athlete style models, right? But when you look at price comparison, they're the same. So I think the biggest takeaway that I hope people can maybe get from this is that, especially if you're a female player, like you don't have to spend more than what you're already spending on your cleats to get a female specific cleat. They are literally the same price. They range anywhere from that, $100 to $200, depending on what brand you get, and depends on kind of like what your needs are. The other caveat that I want to add to that as well is the idea of, so especially as we're talking about youth athletes, we could even get younger into really the pediatric, right? So what are our little girls wearing, to where their foot is still developing, and this could really play a role in their long-term, bone ligament formation. So to that is where Ida Sports and then there's a new Adidas Spark Fusion F50 are, I would say, better options than what Nike and Puma have at the moment, because they actually do have a kids version of their female specific shoe, to where Nike and Puma, they have that women's fit, but they don't have it in kid sizes. So your little girls, I would say get out of Nike and Puma, give Ida or Adidas a try. Other people, you can play around, because there, of course, is still going to be individual variability in all this. Yes, we have some general outlines that we can work with this female-specific design, but ultimately you have to figure out what feels best for you and what is most comfortable for you while playing.
Hey guys, just want to take a quick moment to shout out our sponsor, Simply Faster, and one of my favorite speed timing systems from them, the Freelap. I use it for my own sprint training as well as for my athletes, and they love it. It's super easy to set up, you can take it to the field on your own, and you can get accurate speed times to track your progress. Check the Freelap link in the caption below to start adding timing into your speed sessions. If you know me, you know I love my Freelap. If you're serious about speed, it's time to start timing.
Wow, that was such a great breakdown of all the different brands. And I know a lot of people listening, they're very loyal to their brand. So I think the Adidas coming out with their own version, and then Nike, yeah, it is the women's version, but I know a lot of Nike fanatics listening. That was like very helpful, because I'm just trying to figure out, like, between all the brands, like, yes, the youth is the competitive advantage for Ida and Adidas, but I guess between Ida and Adidas, are there any other competitive advantages that maybe one has that the other doesn't yet? Or is the design still the same with that wide toe box, the stud types, and they're just trying to figure out their next move here to have that advantage?
Yeah, no, so there is some differences that obviously without me being involved in the companies, I can't, what I've tried to see, like just visually when you look at their cleats, like even their stud placement is different. Yes, there's that overall idea of like, being mindful about lateral traction. And yes, they're both using rounded studs instead of a bladed one. But yeah, the positions are all slightly different. So I don't know what their research or data is showing them as to why they placed, that stud in that particular part. I'm sure, of course, that's proprietary for both of them. Maybe another advantage for Ida is that they also have a turf shoe, right? Where the Adidas Spark version only has their firm ground or multi-ground cleats. So I guess that's kind of another good segue to really talk about the role that surface actually plays in your shoe selection. And I think so many players don't appreciate that enough, especially at the youth level. But I still saw it even at the professional level, to where in a perfect world, you would have a different cleat for every surface you're on. So like obviously you've got your indoor shoe, but if you're on a turf field, or if you're on an artificial turf field, or then on a natural grass, like if you potentially play on all four, you would have four different cleats. Obviously, economically, I get that that's not a reality for many. And then also it's just, an inconvenience. Well, you can't be traveling with that many shoes all the time. So that's another thing to look at when you're buying these cleats, no matter which one of these, top brands you're picking. Look at the surface type, because they do say if one is multi-ground or if one is just for firm ground. So say, for instance, if it is a firm ground cleat, you should not be wearing that on artificial turf. It could potentially be really increasing your forces. It's altering that traction. That is where give them some credit that they have done a lot of this mechanical research on that cleat to surface interaction. And I think we all, as consumers, should probably appreciate that a little bit more. And it's definitely something that's now that much more in my mind, because now that I've recently moved to Georgia, I'm learning that we have nothing but turf fields here at all of our high schools. And so it's like, I'm curious to find out as the school year gets started here, how many of my girls are wearing these firm ground cleats, yet we're on artificial turf. And so what role that could be playing. So definitely something to consider a lot more.
Yeah, I agree. And I had a couple months ago Amelia Funnel on from IDA. She's the lead R&D, and she talked a lot about the turf and the grass. And you're right. I think IDA is leading the way with the surfaces, and it's really exciting because I think that's something not a lot of players think about. They just kind of wear the same shoe on everything because of convenience or maybe cost, but I think it is an important discussion to have because everything is turf now, and we can always blame the turf on ACLs, but if you can change your footwear, that's controllable. I don't think turf is going away because it's just easier to maintain.
100%. Yeah. And that's obviously when we talk about injury prevention or performance, we're looking at our buzzword is the modifiable risk factors. And so 100% our cleats, our footwear is something that we can 100% change. And especially when we're looking at soccer specifically, like that's really your primary piece of equipment. It's not like soccer is this equipment heavy sport. So it's not like it's requiring all that much of an investment in other stuff. So like this is something that you should really put a priority on and take seriously and really make sure that it works for you. I think there's kind of been this general acceptance of we all are like, oh yeah, well, my feet hurt and cleats suck and I'm just used to blisters. And it's like, no, we don't have to accept that as normal. It shouldn't be that way. We can do better. UEFA had a great study, like they completed a survey and found that, 80% of players are reporting foot pain. I'm like, that's not right. Like we should not especially given how much advancement in technology and manufacturing we have, clearly we can do better and should do better. And so all of these, female specific cleats are definitely steps in the right direction. And so like I said, I think it's just that awareness is that, females need to be more mindful that there is an option out there for you. Yes, don't get me wrong. We still don't know all the answers about it. We don't know. There's no guarantee that there's a silver bullet in any way, shape, or form as far as making you faster or preventing you from tearing your ACL. But if there's even maybe the smallest fraction of a percent, and when we're looking at there's no cost difference between the male design cleats, why would you not give it a try, right?
Agreed. Yeah, absolutely. And I want to expand on the foot pain. And I have a lot of girls who complain about that, or they'll talk about getting plantar fasciitis. Can the design of these female specific cleats help with things like plantar fasciitis?
Yes, I think so. Once again, research is still needing to be there. So I guess a lot of my claims here are going to be just from my own anecdotal experience working with soccer players, and even just from my own because I've grown up playing myself. So it goes back to that bending stiffness concept, and that's great that you actually brought up Amelia of Ida Sports. So I've had a couple conversations with her, and so she's actually the one that kind of really got me focusing more on bending stiffness. It's actually what I ended up doing my capstone research project on, was really focusing on, this idea. And so what's interesting is that, yeah, we still don't know what that ideal ratio is. Not even on the men's side, there's really not consistency as like, okay, yeah, it's, this is the magic number that we want to balance injury prevention versus performance. But there is some evidence to suggest that you want that, stiffer midfoot and a softer heel. So, what's one way to get that softer heel? You can do things like adding some sort of orthotic insert, heel cushioning, or of course, once again, if you have the female specific brand, I think they are already addressing that naturally built into their shoe. But if for whatever reason you have a male designed one, then yeah, get it. And it doesn't have to be anything fancy. If you're able to get a custom orthotic, love it, fantastic. But if that's not a reality for you, even just a simple gel sole insert or a heel cup focus can help really reduce some of that, because to give you an idea of like these ground reaction forces, so I guess maybe for those that don't know, like, when you step or have an impact, there's a force that shoots back up from the ground. And so in cleats, on average, it's about 30% higher than when you're not in cleats. And so obviously that's going to really impact that shock absorption and that strain on the tissue. So when we're talking about things like plantar fasciitis or Achilles tendinopathy, it makes sense that if you're having, 30% higher than normal forces going through, that's going to make everything work that much harder. And then that 30%, when you're talking about synthetic turfs, is even higher than that. So that's 30% on a natural grass field, right? And so as we talk about the prevalence of turf fields, so we can even really do more research to figure out what that number is actually looking like. The other thing so improving the cushioning and kind of support, I think, is an easy place to start. The next thing is to look at your range of motion. So dorsiflexion is the motion of, pulling your foot up towards your shin. And so especially as soccer players, the sport, you're naturally kind of living in the opposite. You're in a very pointed toe, plantar flex position. And so you naturally are going to lose some of that ankle mobility. But having good ankle dorsiflexion is critical for injury prevention and even for performance, because you want your ankle to be able to go through that full motion. But cleats, so even if you're someone, say, that has perfect ankle dorsiflexion, cleats are still going to decrease your functional available dorsiflexion, which some studies have found that can actually double the force that is going through the calf and the Achilles. So I can speak to, my time when I was at the Orlando Pride. On the daily, plantar fasciitis and Achilles tendinopathy are probably the most common issues that we were having to treat and work with on a daily basis. And so I think that all speaks back to some of these female-specific challenges, because as I had mentioned before, we have weaker tendons. And that's not to say, oh, we can't be strong. Of course we can train, but there still is just a little physiological difference there. So with these weaker tendons, then this lack of dorsiflexion and these higher forces, it makes sense why we're seeing these chronic overuse injuries through the foot and ankle. So kind of my hacks to help address that, of course, would be, doing things to improve your ankle dorsiflexion mobility. So something as simple as stretching your calves, but also making sure you're focusing on rolling out the front of your shins, right? We don't really think about, oh, let me stretch my shins. And it obviously is an awkward thing to stretch. So that's why I say roll out is maybe a little easier way to get some soft tissue release. But then also stretching the toes. It's like these little things that you don't think about, but just grabbing your toe and pulling it down, especially as a soccer player. I think when you start doing it for the first time, you're going to be surprised of how tight and painful that actually is until you start doing it more often. Another little hack that I've come up with and was having some pretty good just anecdotal success from what the players were telling me at the Pride is to wear some silicone toe spacers. Right. So kind of like they look just the same, like when you get your nails done, even if it's just the foam ones. But I know Amazon has ones you can get really cheap and easy. And so we use that as a recovery tool, right? So to kind of battle some of these positional things that are going to happen from time in cleats. So, open up the toes because obviously they're tight and restrictive and we all want that because we want to feel the ball and, all of that. But then when you're out of it, okay, give that foot room to breathe. It helps increase that blood flow, will improve that healing. And so that can have some good results in terms of plantar fasciitis. Then of course, based off if you're all going about strength, right? I could talk for days about the importance of strength. And it is amazing how, especially when we're talking about female athletes, it's such low hanging fruit. And I feel like sometimes we want to overcomplicate and be like, oh, we have to do all this separate stuff. And, of course, there's all this buzz around the menstrual cycle and other things worth asking interesting questions. But at the end of the day, our girls, especially at like the high school youth level, they're just not strong because there hasn't been that culture of getting them in a weight room, doing some strength training. And, so it's been kind of an interesting awareness for me coming from pro sports to, of course, luckily they are addressing it there. But we talk about that's like, it's too late to be dealing with it once you're already a pro. We need to really focus in this developmental stage, set them up for long-term success. I'm back in the high school and I'm seeing girls. I'm like, I'm like, wow, they can't even do a body weight squat or they can't do even a clamshell, like it. So it's like, it doesn't have to be more complicated than that. There's truly just so much base strength that is lacking, especially in youth female athletes. And so that's going to play a huge role in things like Achilles tendinopathy and plantar fasciitis.
Yeah, thank you for touching on that. We talk about strength all the time on this podcast. And I think also with the youth female athletes, they're really underestimated by coaches and parents. And they can lift a little bit heavier than the 5s, 10s, and even 15s. So, as long as you coach the technique and it's good form, they can start to really load and build that strength. And just coming back to the foot, I mean, it really is the base to every movement. And I'm glad you're really touching on a lot of the change of direction movements and from an injury reduction standpoint, but also performance, and just lacking that ankle dorsiflexion can really get someone behind in their change of direction movements, and it could cause that knee to be unstable and that ankle. So that's really important too. And then for the injury side as well, I do want to ask about severs or severs. Everyone calls it a different thing. Yeah,
I've always called it severs.
Yeah, me too. So I heard someone say severs. I was like, have I been wrong this whole time? But so yeah, severs. I see that a lot in the youth girls space. And yes, people have to manage load and rest and do strength, but I do want to touch on how footwear can impact it as well. So if you want to get into that.
Yeah. And so once we're talking about those forces, we're talking about that weaker tendon. So if that strength is not being addressed and the cleats are putting you in a poor biomechanical position, you're going to get stress and therefore you're going to get injury. And so, yeah, that plays a role. And even to touch on like the load management side, there's just kind of another thing I like to bring people up to is just like that total exposure time in cleats. And because we know that there are just some things that cleats are doing to us that are not ideal, let's be in them as little as possible, right? Like don't, if you know that from like the locker room to the field is a certain amount of a walk, well, then take those cleats off. Don't put your cleats on until you're actually on the pitch and ready to play, and then get out of them as quickly as you can. That's kind of become my new mantra, is to, I mean, obviously, yes, cleats are great and important while you're playing and doing your activity. There's no doubt about that. But then if you're not doing that, get the heck out of them, because they are eventually will start maybe doing more harm than good. That's kind of my theory behind it. And yeah, and so it's like, you see the people, and I did it myself too, right? To where you're in the parking lot of the field and you're walking across, concrete and pavement in your cleats until you get to the field. And I'm like, oh my, like now that I have more understanding, I'm like, gosh, even I know it seems so trivial, but when you start doing that every weekend, day in, day out, some of these multi-game tournaments, I'm like, that's ridiculous. The amount of unnecessary extra strain and forces that we're putting our foot and ankle under by maybe just being in our cleats way more often than we need to.
Yeah. I didn't even think about that. Yeah, we definitely walked across the parking lot like a mile to the field in cleats. And
Yeah.
yeah, looking back, that didn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And I run track now, and it makes so much sense why these track athletes, they put on their spikes right before the race, but they walked into the meet in their sneakers or barefoot. And we should just model after them as soccer players. So that does make a lot of sense. Now, do you recommend youth soccer players walk around barefoot a lot, or just not even be in any type of footwear?
Yes. So I'm a
Okay.
big component of, so a different soapbox for a different day about, barefoot and minimalist footwear. I've really absorbed it to myself. There's another athletic trainer. Her name is Jen Shu. She's doing a lot of good research. I believe she's based out of the University of Virginia. But as to me, the reason why I like barefoot is it circles back to foot strength, especially those intrinsic foot muscles. So of course we can talk about, sure, do calf raises, get a strong calf muscle gastroc, that's important, but are we working on all those little tiny guys? Like, can you spread your toes and open them, or can you even just lift your toes up on their own and curl them? Because it seems weird to do those motions in isolation. But of course, when we think about athletics, they are all working just as hard, but at rapid high speeds and with really large forces. So if we aren't training that, then that's just another thing you're missing. So to me, the easiest way, so if you haven't maybe been shown specific exercises that would strengthen that, then just simply walking in barefoot will get that naturally. Now, of course, you have to be mindful as you're doing this, right? Because most of us, because of our footwear historically, and this gets beyond just cleats, right? Especially females, wear high heels. Like, you're never going to catch me in a high heel, I'll be totally honest, with now all that I know, right? But like, and then even our other shoes, right? Like, so much we're getting scrunched, and like all these things that have been accepted as normal, to where across the board, our society, we have weak feet now. And so of course you can't just go straight from, wearing normal shoes to going to barefoot all the time, or wearing minimalist shoes, because that could increase your risk of injury once you don't have that strength built up. But can you maybe just create some sort of gradual progression for yourself, where it's like, okay, I'm going to walk around 10 minutes barefoot today, and then, do that for a week. And the next week, increase that time, right? And so you gradually build that strength up, so that way you don't unnecessarily strain these muscles that weren't prepared to do something, but you can continue to slowly build that over time. And so, yeah, so I'm a big proponent of that. But once again, you have to get that foundational, especially I know in the weight room, there's a big move for, lifting weights barefoot, which I fully support if you are prepared for it. If you've never done it, don't go do a full workout, because I promise it's going to hurt. You are not prepared to stabilize in those new positions and control that new range of motion that you will experience, right? So as with everything, it's all about gradual progressions, which I know in our culture is hard to accept, because we are all in instant gratification. We want things right away, or we want it to be a flashy, TikTok fun looking intervention. And the reality, it's a lot more simple and basic than that. And that's not, basic doesn't sell, and it's not as marketable and exciting, but it is so important. And so if you just start small and build. I promise you will see the results, but you have to accept a level of patience in that.
Yeah, that's really great advice. And gosh, I wish I did all this when I was a teenage soccer player, because now it's like I'm starting to undo years of foot damage. I mean, I'm at the point where I have bunions now, and I don't know how much pain that's going to cause me when I'm in my 60s or 70s. And you'll actually laugh at this. I texted Chat GPT a picture of my foot, and it literally said, "Oh, it looks like you're a former soccer player. You have the classic bunched up toes." And I'm like, "How the hell did it know this?"
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, "Are my toes that bad?"
Yeah. No, that's great that you brought it up though, because that is something like there is a study. I know I kind of touched on that idea about, why I like Ida Sports, because they actually do have, and even the new Adidas one, because they actually have something for girls. But it is so important. Like as a young person, you are developing. And so there is evidence already that we've seen that, yeah, the time spent in cleats at the youth level, developing through academies, it is changing what your foot shape looks on later in life. And so it's like, yeah, so what role does that play? So I think there's a lot of this, it's a bit of like playing the long game, right? To where, okay, maybe you don't see some sort of immediate decrease in injury risk or even in performance enhancement, like right while you're wearing it. But yeah, where are you going to be, versus the 5-year-old girl starting to play soccer? And when she's 20 and playing in college, is she going to be in a so much better level to then, protect herself? I think that's super important to address. And I've experienced that myself as well. Thinking back to my high school years, I was constantly dealing with big toe pain in my right foot specifically. And let's talk about like the snowball effect of that, where I got into the habit of just taking ibuprofen and stupid amounts of ibuprofen, before and after every training, and then doubling that on game days, right? And so it's like, then I could go into a whole spiral about how I have now gone through a battle of an autoimmune disorder and gastrointestinal issues. And so like there's this part of me like, man, how much damage or did I set myself up for these problems I've now dealt with as an adult, because I was totally abusing ibuprofen because I had toe pain, because I wasn't in the right fitting cleat. I was in a cleat too often, and I wasn't addressing the strength imbalances and the mobility issues. And so it's all very complex. Like, I think that's what's so hard with all this, is that we're all looking for a silver bullet, easy answer, and it's not, because it's so multifactorial. Context matters on all of this. But so since I've switched to barefoot shoes, I have seen some major improvements to where I no longer am having issues with plantar fasciitis. And even as far as looking at my toes, I have seen they're starting to get back to normal, to where like mine was like totally like looking all funky, and it's not as bad anymore. Like I can, but granted, it's taken like, I've been in minimal issues for like 3 years now. So it's taken 3 years, but I can actually be like, oh wow, hey, my toe's actually not angled in as far anymore. But it takes time.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I just started wearing the Ida sneakers. So comfortable, by the way. And I don't wear anything else anymore. And I was like loyal to Adidas. And now I'm just in Idas all the time. And I just started doing it, and I haven't seen changes yet, but you reminded me this is a long process, and you can reverse it though. That's the good news. But at the same time, we don't want our girls to ruin their feet young, and then by the time maybe they play college or pro soccer, they have bunions or jam toes or hammer toes, or maybe later in life they have to get bunion surgery. I mean, if you've looked that up on YouTube, it's pretty disgusting and
and
terrible
really
surgery.
not even that effective or great, in all honesty. Because I mean, I've had some youth athletes that have gotten it, and I'm like, there's no evidence to support that makes any sense. Like, as a high schooler,
who would go through that at a young age?
and so once again, it's that educational piece, right? People don't know what they don't know, and it's frustrating, obviously, since I'm like so hyper focused in the space, I go crazy over it for sure. But
Wow.
we can do better but people just have to know that there's other options and all the little pieces that come into play to it.
Now, is there anything you want to wrap this up with? Just any other things people should be looking for in footwear or just some words of encouragement?
Um, to me, just very simply, if you are a female, get a female specific shoe. Like as we discussed, they're out there. The two most prominent, and I guess my ones I would push towards would be Ida Sports or the new Adidas Spark Fusion F50. But so just be a more conscious consumer and know that as a female athlete, you do not have to accept less, and that there are people actively out there trying to make things better and safer for you overall and long term.
Awesome. I think that is such great advice to end on. And there might be some Nike people being like, oh, okay, maybe we'll make the switch. But I mean, they don't have the youth one yet. And a lot of people listening are parents of young female athletes. So really keep that in mind because the youth design is so different. The growth spurts are happening as well. There's so many changes. So I agree with you, Amanda. I think a youth female specific cleat is the way to go for our young girls.
Yeah,
But
definitely.
maybe a year from now, Nike will come out with theirs. Who knows when this podcast
No,
releases?
exactly. Or maybe it'll be in 2 weeks. Is like with how
Yeah,
quickly Adidas
exactly. I
suddenly
mean,
did. Like, I doubt that. Like, there's no way they're going to hesitate long now that Adidas has done it. That's just the
yeah.
reality. But it's a good reality, right? I'll take it.
Yeah. And no, it's good we have this competition going on because we're just trying to better the footwear for our female athletes. So it's good we have these options because when we were growing up, we had none. So it's good news and it's hopeful. So I learned a lot on this. I hope everyone listening did as well. Please be sure to follow Amanda. I'll link all of her social website, everything in the caption below. So definitely check her out. And please share this podcast with someone who you feel needs to hear this, who needs to learn more about footwear. We are so excited to get the message out on this podcast. So thank you for listening, and I'll see everyone on the next episode.